In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 astronauts on board and forcing the United States to confront a painful question about how complex systems ignore warning signs. After the disaster, physicist Richard Feynman wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." Feynman was talking about engineering, but same rule governs intelligence. Reality doesn't bend to narrative. Systems fail when leaders start believing their own preferred version of event-making, the way the final Rogers Commission report described the disaster as particularly apt, an accident rooted in history. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's March 23rd, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm good. It's another beautiful day in Austin. We've had a particularly glorious weekend. And so on this pretty spring morning, what's on my mind is my friend and colleague, Robert Mueller, who just passed away. Bob spent a lifetime in service to his country as a Marine, as a prosecutor, the director of the FBI, and later a special counsel. I didn't always agree with his conclusions, but you always knew this. He did his duty as he saw it with integrity and with respect for the institutions he served. In a moment when too many people treat public service as something to mock or diminish, even worse than the nobility that I always considered it, I think it's worth pausing to recognize that kind of life, his kind of life, and what that actually means. And just from an intelligence community's perspective, Bob took the job as director of FBI the day before 9/11. Think about that. He basically,
Really? Holy cow.
Holy cow. And he was called to answer. I mean, just remember the whole thing was the intelligence community had said, there's a blinking red light, but we didn't say where where it was pointing. And in the days that followed, there's just a lot that was uncovered about what could have been known about disconnects. It certainly led to the formation of the DNI. But what I think is not as well publicized is what it meant and what Robert Mueller did to completely recraft the FBI against that kind of threat, the importance of national security and the FBI as an intelligence organization as well as a law enforcement organization. And over his 10 years, so remember he served 8 years of the Republican and then was asked to continue by Obama, he really, really transformed how the FBI worked against this new modern threat of threats just being able to come to our homeland, even if they originated overseas. So I think it's too easy now to not see, and I kind of miss the nobility that we felt when we were the ones practicing that. So a really fine American and someone whose life is worth remembering fondly.
Yeah. Semper Fi, Devil Dog. Rest in peace. Talk about a career of public service from a Vietnam platoon commander, decorated combat veteran, all the way through the service at the FBI. And I didn't realize right before 9/11, what significant timing. Wow.
Yeah. And, he sat in front of the commission and basically took the heat, right? Because all the failures basically happened before his watch. And I remember watching those hearings and he took the heat for it and was steadfast about, we got to move forward. We got to be better. We got to be responsible. So a lot of good stuff. Also, there's a really great 2013 speech that he gave at his law school, UVA, that maybe we'll put a link in the notes. It's a really lovely, almost eulogy to how he saw the world. And again, don't be confused. No one is perfect and you don't agree with everything, but hard to have a better life of service than his.
Speaking of good runs, my thing to talk about is a little better spirited, but I had a perfect bracket through the first round of the women's tournament. I was ranked in like the top 1,000 or so. And then it all came crashing down. I missed. At one point on Sunday, I had only dropped one game. I missed UVA upsetting Georgia in the women's bracket, and then it came back down to reality.
One, good for you. Way to pay attention to the game. Historically, with the women's draw, you can go a little more chalky than you can with the men. I think I got super excited about what I see as growing parity in the women's college game and probably over rotated on that. But still, some really good games. I went to Texas, Oregon yesterday in person at the Moody, and man, packed house. It was kind of a blowout. Texas was on their game, worthy of a number one seed, but no one left early, and it was raucous. So from a woman who used to play in gyms where if the clock operator screwed up and the clock kept running, everyone could hear the fuck, fuck, fuck going, to now this, it makes me super happy. And congratulations, Eric.
We'll see. We'll see if I can keep it rolling. What are we talking about today?
So today we're looking at the intelligence community's worldwide threat assessment and the congressional hearing that accompanied it. Every year, the intelligence leaders come to Capitol Hill and publicly describe the most significant threats facing the United States. But those hearings are more than the threats themselves. They're also one of the few places where the intelligence and policy meet in public. So we're going to talk about what the IC said about the world, what the members of Congress were trying to get out of them, and what that interaction tells us about how our system is working right now. So you're going to hear about the assessment itself and about how this year differs from previous years. The hearing reveals natural tension between intelligence and policy and oversight. And the real signal I think we're going to take out of it is whether intelligence can speak candidly while policymakers debate what to do about it. And my spoiler alert for our audience is that healthy systems keep those roles distinct. And when they blur, both intel and policy suffer. Oh, and I'll probably share some inside baseball about my experiences with the annual threat assessment and the public hearings.
Yeah, something tells me you may be uniquely qualified to comment on this topic.
Mayhaps, mayhaps.
All right, let's get to it. So every year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence publishes what's called the Annual Threat Assessment, intelligence community's official evaluation of an array of threats to U.S. citizens, the homeland, and U.S. interests around the world. Every word reflects a deliberate choice about what the community is confident about, what it is less sure of, and where legitimate disagreement exists among analysts. When you read a phrase like, "we assess with high confidence," that's a calibrated statement that went through layers of review across multiple agencies. And when something is conspicuously absent from the document, when a topic that appeared in previous years suddenly disappears, that tells us something too. So, Sue, what does this document mean to the IC, both setting internal priorities, but also for external communication to the rest of government, the American people, as well as our adversaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this sharing intelligence assessments publicly is still a work in progress for the intelligence community. And here's what I mean. In general, we're most comfortable sharing all the information we have in order to give the rationale behind an assessment. And I think we've talked about this several times. And one of the reasons why we do that when we're writing a classified report is because we always know that we're missing some information or that one piece of information is right around the corner after we've put the assessment out that will change it entirely. So you try and be really precise and really inclusive and really systemic about how you make these assessments. So that's how we like making assessments in general when they're classified. A community assessment really represents the whole of the intelligence community's view of it. Now that we know that this is our communication with the American people, something I wholly believe in, we strip out a lot of the underlying detail, leave the top level conclusions. That already makes it a little less precise. And it is the aggregate of what everyone believes. I used to say that a coordinated document is something that everyone agrees to and nobody believes. So, one, the assessment is the community's best assessment of the aggregation of worldwide threats facing the United States. When it is presented publicly in a hearing, and you typically will have two different versions. One, you'll have a classified and unclassified data. The unclassified hearings are always harder for the intelligence community because we can't explain or don't explain all our rationale. And a public hearing always creates the opportunity for our overseers to find difference between the policy that the intelligence is intended to inform and the intelligence assessment. So different things, although they're super important. I think it's important to share with the American people just because of the nature of threats, and keeping a secret is hard, and so you look sketchy when you keep secrets. But I also think when I was doing them, it was much more a recitation and an explanation of the intelligence assessment. And now over time, we seem to have moved more into questioning whether the policy has been driven by those assessments. And I think that's one of the ways to think about a difference between the assessment you read, that is the best analytic judgment, and the hearing that you listen to, which is that tension between intelligence assessment, policy agreement, and overseers doing their job.
I think that's really good kind of background in helping us gauge because there is a lot of tension there. Or you can go in with unreasonable expectations when you don't think about the classified version and the behind closed doors and some of the things. It's not that it becomes diluted, but you do have to approach it with a different perspective of what's actually going to be presented in this hearing versus what's actually been published.
Yeah, and I think one of the things when I say it's a work in progress doing this intelligence work publicly, again, and I'm a big believer in more transparency is good, not just for the secrecy. We'll talk more about that at some point, is harder and harder to do because the world knows everything. But the other thing is what you mentioned earlier, and that is the words that we use are super precise. Right?
Mhm.
The difference between probable and possible, likely, unconfirmed, correlated, causal, those words all matter a lot when you're in the intelligence community because you want to be super precise about how well you know something, how much someone should stake a decision on this assessment. And man, there have been times in the past where that precision and understanding how good we were at our assessment was really important. We won't talk about it in great depth here, but the 2003 decision on Iraq WMD is a classic example of not being super precise about how thin our reasoning was for making that assessment. Another great example is the whole brouhaha, that feels like too light a word, over the argument over whether the intelligence community assessment regarding Russian attempts to influence the 2016 election
Yeah.
are being seen as either genuine or not, when from an intelligence community's perspective, we made a huge difference between the word interference, which was actually involved in the voting and the mechanisms and the processes, which there weren't, and influence trying to shape the outcome of the election, which where there's plenty of evidence. And to us, those two words meant a whole lot. Man, in the light of day, you can see that that precision can almost be confusing. And so I think learning how to talk precisely in an unclassified fashion is probably one of the areas that the intelligence community still needs to work on. I think there will always be a need for precision in the language, but I do think you have to think about the lexicon that you need to be able to use when you're speaking to non-insiders. An
Mhm.
analog to it is you hear this, "Quit talking so technical. Tell me what the outcome you're trying to achieve." And my experience is that if you need a different outcome, I need this to be better understood, the easiest place to start is in the people that most understand the differences you're trying to convey. When I would go into even a National Security Council meeting or into hearings like this, the question I would ask myself after I'd been prepped, because remember, the leader is only as smart as the women and men that do the actual assessments that you convey honestly. I always ask myself two questions, and that was, what do I need to make sure they hear? And what do I need to make sure they don't understand? So I think when we talk more openly, we have to be doubly mindful, again, from the originator side, about our responsibility to make sure that we are heard and understand correctly, not just demanding that they be better at listening.
Yeah, and making sure what they don't misunderstand, that's really important. Let's talk more about the differences in this specific assessment, though, and kind of get your thoughts on what stood out to you. So, first, I wanted to point out how technology, and specifically AI, has moved from the background to the foreground and has become a strategic threat category. It's previously showed up in discussions of cyber threats or military modernization, but it was all in a supporting role. Technology isn't changing just how threats are delivered, it's changing what constitutes a threat in the first place. So, that was
Yeah.
interesting. Second was this idea of great power competition. So China remains the primary strategic competitor. Russia, Iran, and North Korea each get substantial treatment. Third was this idea of transnational criminal organizations. And the whole report begins with a focus on the homeland, talking about border incursions, drug and human trafficking, etc. And then fourth, this is one that generated the most attention. For the first time since 2017, the annual threat assessment does not include a section on foreign interference in U.S. elections. Sue, what stood out to you from both recent years and as someone who's reviewed this document, and I imagine red penned some of those specific words, and then testified to Congress on its significance?
So I think the technology as a strategic threat is a really interesting new topic, especially for it to be captured in the annual threat assessment, because it really is taking it from, as we used to see it, as a tool of national power, including of our adversaries. What capabilities do they have in order to be able to affect power in the traditional political military sense? And now it's more, what does the technology do to the overall environment? So I think it's a good move, all the technologies they mentioned, because there are a lot more forces acting on it than just national power, but competitive forces, complete changes that some technologies allow nation states or adversaries, competitors to have in terms of intention. I used to always say that the technology reflects the intent, and the intent is pretty consistent. But take cyber as an example. When anyone could travel any distance at no cost, it allowed some adversaries and competitors to be able to change what kinds of things they could use to affect their intentions. They could use interference in elections, or they could do cyber theft. And this is not just our adversaries and competitors to us, but just worldwide. You see electronic action on elections and shaping deals and stealing intellectual property. And so thinking about technology as more than just military and political power is one. The other thing that I would suggest, that inside the intelligence community, when you make this assessment that technology has its place, intelligence is going to have to get much better at assessing more broadly what threats, what vulnerabilities technologies pose. For about the last decade, this is too harsh a term, but we've almost punted on assessing which technologies are going to make a difference, whether to our economic strength or to global competitive forces, saying that we aren't in the intelligence community. Look at me, we. The intelligence community isn't best. The intelligence community isn't best positioned to make assessments of technology. That's really the private sector. No, no. When you want to decide which technologies have to be controlled, which technologies can be exported, you have to have a much more reasonable assessment within the intelligence community. For the same reason that intelligence in general is important, it is exactly because it is almost anodyne in an assessment of what is. It allows you to make decisions about what you should do separately based on the same foundation. So I think when the threat assessment is so clear about how it sees technology, I think if I were on the Hill and I would have asked questions about this, if I had been a senator or a representative, I would say, yeah, so what are you going to do about being better able to help our country, whether it's the Commerce Department or it's the private sector deciding where they ought to take money, and how are you
Yeah.
going to get better? So I think the technology piece is right. I think it drives changes to the craft of intelligence with respect to technology. Now, the great power competition, I love that it was included, and I like that we kind of cited it as a bit of a difference, and that's, you're saying, great power competition. We've been talking about that for 20 years. Yeah, but this assessment talks about it really differently. it talks about it much less in terms of malign actors. The way I would have talked about it is that Russia wants to undermine democracy, especially that which is practiced by the West, and that China believes that it can win the global competition for economic power and driving the economic systems. If you look at this assessment, it really is much more about the systems behind great power competition than it is about anyone being a bad guy. And I think if you squint at it, you can say, you know what, this is really reflective of a move toward a much more economic security view of the world than a political military view of the world, is much more aligned with how this president sees the world in terms of leverage, transactions, and tactics. I don't think it is wrong to see that change, because I think as soon as we became digitally connected as a world, economic considerations increased. I will say if you only have an economic view of how geopolitics works, you miss some important things like how deterrence happens, the importance of alliances, the role of intention. And so the biggest difference I noticed when President Trump came to office in his first administration was, one, he didn't really get government and all the systems and how it worked or why we even had it. Why couldn't he just do what he wanted to do? But the second thing is, you all aren't very good at this economic thing. It's much more about leverage and deals. And I could go into reasons why. I think this is very consistent with his view. I wouldn't put it as just a Trump policy thing. I think it is, in a way, how the world is moving. But if you rotate too far on this, it's all leverage. It's all transactions. I think you're going to miss the backbreaking physical labor that is big world systems that are more than just a deal away. And it's a little too early to look at Iran in this light, but I think you could be able to look at other things. I do think the no emphasis on election interference is, well, one, I don't think it intellectually makes much sense because, again, I don't think there's any diminution in the availability of digital means to shape the views of other governments, including our own. I don't think there's a whit of evidence that says there aren't people out there that still will steal intellectual property or have the capability to be able to do things, even though we're working much harder to defeat those things. So I'm surprised to see it go away as much as it kind of disappeared from this, because I don't think that's consistent. I also think, just now this is total commentary, I think it's a little inconsistent with, well, then why is Tulsi Gabbard in Fulton County? If election interference by foreign adversaries is no longer an issue for us, why does the DNI need to be there? So I think there, on this one, it feels questionable to me. And on a personal kind of national security threat, listen, we have not seen the worst of what cyber can do. The
Yeah.
fact that adversaries and competitors have not used it, whether to cause economic or infrastructure mayhem, or that they haven't even tried more aggressively against our election infrastructure, especially as we seem to be de-emphasizing it. Don't be confused about the capability that exists if push comes to shove. And I don't think the world has gotten more peaceful. So this one feels like a miss to me. I try really hard not to assign intent if I'm not in someone's head, or decisions if I wasn't sitting in the chair. But this one feels at best myopic, and at worst an example of an intelligence assessment that was pulled because it wasn't convenient for a policy push.
Yeah, cybersecurity, especially since cyber can affect our basic infrastructure and really impact the home front and some of
Yeah.
our daily lives. The only mention of elections in the whole document is regarding Haiti's elections in August, and tied back to some of the risk of migrants and migrant threat that then poses to the border and the homeland and stuff. So not just lessened in it, just completely removed. And so I think you're absolutely right.
Again, the intelligence assessment is the intelligence community's analytic assessment of the intentions and capabilities of adversaries and competitors against the United States. Whether we're prepared to defend it, whether we're not prepared to defend it, whether it's imminent, whether it's latent, right? There's a sanctity to it. And that is, I'm gonna give you my best shot on all of it. You can also go back, and there were questions in COVID. Was it called out enough in the earlier threat assessments? The risk of pandemic, there was, but those kinds of questions. But this one, the assessment itself has got to be ruthless about the best view of the intelligence community's view of not only the individual threats, but the complexity and the interaction of this. A lot of decision making is going to have to happen after that. How many resources do we put against them? What policies do we effect to address them? But this document has got to be the best view. And this feels, based on what we know, and not just, again, against the U.S., I'm talking about this is a global problem of this messing in elections for the low price of $1 million and a few offensive tools. So feels like either a miss or a misunderstanding of what this assessment needs to be, even when inconvenient. Because you can say it's a threat, and then you can decide that I don't have the resources to go against it, but you first must say it's a threat. Because there are a lot of people waiting for this assessment to be able to make decisions about what they need to do to be prepared.
Sure. And how those subordinate agencies set their priorities. We just called out AI, but the assessment also mentions quantum as well. So cryptology and stuff there. So worth a shout out to quantum.
I really love the technology piece, and I love the way it's captured. Again, what happens next is what you do of it, and we still have sign of some systemic issues, particularly with technologies, especially since we now know that a lot of the action on some of the technical threats happened at the state and local or private sector level. Again, you and I have called out on AI policy and cyber policy some EOs that we think are moving in the right direction. So when you call out the technology, I think you're setting the groundwork for doing some really interesting things, not just at the federal level, but calling it out so state and local and private sector can do things with those things as well.
All right, let's talk about some of the fireworks and the hearing itself. So the briefing is the ODNI's statutory responsibility, and DNI Gabbard was joined by the directors of the CIA, FBI, DIA, and NSA. The opening statement is worth paying attention to as well, because there's a version that was prepared. It's the written text that gets submitted into the record. And then there's what the DNI actually says out loud in the room and responding to the questions from the senators. The Iran conflict definitely took center stage here, and it was kind of the imminent threat question. And we'll cover some of the more interesting exchanges. But Senator Ossoff, the young Democrat of Georgia, I like to call people my age young, he asked Gabbard directly whether the intelligence community assessed that Iran posed an imminent nuclear threat to the United States, which is one of the justifications the administration has used for the military strikes. Her answer, quote, "The only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president." He pushed back hard. He told her it is precisely her responsibility to determine what constitutes a threat. That's why it's called a worldwide threats hearing. And then the plot thickens. Director Gabbard included in the written remarks that Iran's nuclear enrichment program had been, quote, obliterated by U.S. and Israeli strikes, and that there had been no efforts to rebuild it. She didn't read that part out loud, but the whole thing gets entered into the record. And so when asked why she skipped it, she ran out of time, she said. Senator Mark Warner, his response was blunt. He said she chose to omit the parts that contradict the president. Oops. Sue, do the senators get a copy of that report in advance, or are they reading it real time?
Yeah, they get it ahead of time. I think it's actually published ahead of time. They get a copy of the written statement. Now, I will say, everyone's playing a little game here. You try and submit that as late as you possibly can for exactly this reason. Not only did they have a copy of the report, but they also had a copy of her opening statement. So it was, they were ready for her then to, in her oral comments, not say some things. And I think that was a mistake on her part. Boy, I thought that was uncomfortable in a lot of reasons. Number one is Senator Ossoff is exactly right. It is precisely the intelligence community's responsibility to assess the imminence of a threat. That's part of the threat, is that it's imminent. And to say that is only he can make that assessment. That's your contribution to his policy setting and decision making. So what he has the ability to do is say, yeah, I'm not going to listen to that. I have my own reasons for thinking I want to do that. I'm either am or I'm not going to share them. But when you blur this idea that somehow he is responsible for the threat, he is responsible for the intelligence, you've messed up the value of it. In a weird sort of way, intelligence is just advice. Now, I think what you're hearing play out in the hearing, what you're hearing play out in the
Heyo.
hearing, yeah, is that it's like, whoa, 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 but the American people wanted to know why you did this then, right? Because we do now know what the intelligence said. And she was completely accurate. The intelligence said exactly what Ossoff was inferring, that there was not an imminent threat. More than that, their nuclear capability had been significantly diminished, and there was no evidence that they were trying to start. That was so clear. And what was interesting about Director Gabbard is she tried to walk that line where she tried to make a place where she was defending the analytic judgment because there's absolutely no evidence to the contrary, and leave the president some room on his policy. But the problem is you're leaving the wrong room. The room is he can decide what to do about it. It is really hard for leaders to say, yes, I have this valid assessment and I'm going to ignore it. But they can. And so her job is to not shade the intelligence. There are two versions of politicization of intelligence. One of them is the intelligence community wanting to please policy so much that it writes assessments that are favorable to it. The other politicization is saying, I made this decision because the intelligence was something different than they said. That is also politicization. You don't have to do either. You just have to be, excuse me, Eric, man enough to say, yes, that is true, and I am doing this, and then make the argument to the American people about why what you've done was more important than that assessment. And because we haven't had the benefit of that explanation, it gets oogie, and it felt to me like Director Gabbard was trying to leave some room. But I think Ossoff was right to call it out and to say that no, that is not actually his job to decide on the imminence of the threat.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Also, because there are so many other justifications for strikes in Iran, right? It's not just nuclear, but absolutely worth calling it out. And then the other one was the election interference. So Senator Warner pressed her on why foreign election interference was absent. But the hearing also surfaced the related issue, which you alluded to previously, Director Gabbard's presence at an FBI raid in Fulton County, Georgia, the election center earlier this year, where agents seized election materials related to the 2020 election. Senator Warner wanted to know what authority the DNI had to be involved in a domestic law enforcement operation targeting election infrastructure.
I don't think she had a good answer for why it wasn't included in the assessment itself, and I think that was a perfectly valid question to ask. I think what Senator Warner highlighted when he asked his questions, he said, is there, or someone else I think also asked this question, do you have explicit intelligence about attempted interference in Georgia or anything right now? And her answer was, we are always looking at ongoing threats, right? Or something to that, which is true, but not germane. And so I think it's like policy community wanting its cake and eating it too. I want to be able to say that there is election interference when I want to use it to question what was going on in Georgia. And I want to be able to say that Russia wasn't trying to influence the election when that isn't convenient. And I think what you have is, again, Director Gabbard kind of stuck between her role as representing the intelligence assessment. And again, I think there is much more room for criticism on election interference because it was just underplayed in the assessment itself. But I think she was also guilty a little bit of wanting to protect the policymakers in a way that every leader wants to, but an intelligence leader has to protect against, because that just muddies the water. And ultimately, I worry that it leads to bad intelligence and bad decision-making if you do that. So the criticisms were correct on the assessment. They were valid. And I think what Senator Warner's questions highlighted was Director Gabbard still trying to protect the policy of the president. And what she sacrificed was her allegiance to the craft discipline and judgments of her intelligence community. I don't know if we're going to talk about this, but I get it. That's a really hard moment. I've said this before, is one of the most difficult things about intelligence, besides the fact that you always know that you have incomplete information and they still want to know what it says, is that you are well aware that you are making, in so many cases, a leader's work harder because you're taking away, if they listen to what you say, if you have made the best case for it, you're taking away from them some of the things they might want to do or some of the reasons they might want to give. And that's an uncomfortable moment for a person who has been nominated by a political leader to then stand in front in an open hearing and say, yeah, it's inconvenient. But it was totally appropriate that she got these questions. I understand what she was trying to do by her answers. I think she was not true to her responsibility as the head of the intelligence community and what intelligence represents in the U.S. policy and decision-making mechanism.
Yeah. And some of the members asked those pointed, specific questions that forced real engagement, like Senator Ossoff and Senator Warner, but
Mhm.
others used their time for political positioning and grandstanding, which, like you said, is pretty standard and also not new, but the ratio kind of matters. And
Yeah.
when more of the hearing is theater than oversight, we all lose because this is an opportunity to get some explanation for the American people. A couple of the other topics that we wanted to call out that seemed more like regurgitation rather than real assessment to me. Border security. She cited the 83.8% reduction in border encounters as evidence the administration policies are working. The emphasis on transnational criminal organizations and those drivers of immigration that I talked about earlier, those haven't gone away. And the instability in countries like Cuba and Haiti could trigger new surges, is what they're calling. We've also got a Taiwan invasion timeline. So, interested in your perspective on how important that is to include in the assessment. China's military modernization and its posture toward Taiwan came up in the broader great power competition framing we talked about. And the assessment describes an expanding missile threat from China's ambitions in AI and space, but the hearing didn't provide a clear public statement on the invasion timeline, which has been
Okay.
the historical. And then Russia, Ukraine. So the assessment treats Russia as a persistent threat, missile development, cyber operations, continued aggression. But the hearing dynamics around Russia were shaped by the broader political
Yeah.
context, and the war in Ukraine was in the background. So, what were some of your takeaways?
Each one in a different way represents an example of nothing tragically wrong in this moment of time for what is on this political leadership's agenda, but intelligence is about just, we have this as our tagline for understandable insights, and that is seeing the world as it is, not as you prefer it to be. So this is a threat assessment, not an assessment of goodness of the policy. So if those numbers are the numbers on that, we really believe that the threat associated with illegal crossings of our borders and the bringing in of material that is harmful to America, whether that is illegal technology or fentanyl or just massive migration, cite those and spare the judgment of the political goodness or badness, because in this case, it was good, but you still want to highlight the issue so that it is always on the forefront of things that can change. And Taiwan is minimized for a different reason, or its minimization is problematic in a different reason. I have no idea what the timeline for Xi to decide that he wants to do something about his stated purpose of reunifying it. But I think there is reason to assess his capability and to do assessments of his political will, intention, and likely outcome and signals and observables of it. But even more important, one of the great things about a worldwide threat assessment is it is the beginning of a conversation with the American people about things that might ultimately turn out to be important to them, Iran. If we'd paid attention to Iran more maybe we would have been readier for the conversation. I worry that if something happens with Taiwan and we don't have the conversations with the American people, I will tell you, for as much as we're feeling the economic impact of what's going on in Iran, it looks like junior high compared to the type of economic impacts the world will feel if China moves on Taiwan and we do or don't decide to get involved militarily. And so again, when you don't talk about in those terms, when you don't talk about the imminence of a threat, the likelihood of an action, the perspective on what's going on, you diminish the value of the open conversation, the intelligence, which is a part of a conversation with the American people that in an economically driven world does affect them even more profoundly than a war does. And then Russia-Ukraine feels a bit like, we've moved beyond that, right? At best, it's inconvenient. And at worst, is I don't want to counter Putin. So that feels like it's one everyone just wanted to move beyond because it was so difficult to discuss in terms of what's going on with Iran, what we're really doing to our defense industry, what we're really doing in terms of free and open societies. And it just felt like one that was minimized, again, for the reasons of political convenience, even from the senator's perspective, by the way, and not really as true as I would like it to be to a real assessment of what the threat is. Remember the word threat. Even in the places we've identified in the threat assessment itself, there were some strengths and weaknesses. In the hearing itself, it was basically sacrificing the sanctity of the intelligence judgment for the partisanship of the policy discussion. That's the way it felt to me.
Yeah. Ukraine was so 2025.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Zelensky's like, hey, I do anti-drone stuff. Come on, guys. Come over here. We can help you out.
Didn't Putin say, I'll stop providing targeting information to the Iranians if you pull back from Ukraine? So, yeah, it's modestly lurking. And again, you're just missing an opportunity. I wouldn't mind it so much if it was just in the hearing, although I would always like the hearing to be more reflective of that conversation. But you really want to go back and look at the threat assessment itself and see whether it did the intelligence community's job of accurately reflecting the threats and the complexity of the threats and the interactions of the threats.
I think it could also be helpful if we contrast this with the last time you testified before that committee in spring of 2019. How did you view that responsibility and kind of what the world looked like 7 years ago?
Yeah, so 17 to 2019, Senator Dan Coates was the director of national intelligence. I was his principal deputy. We actually hadn't had a threat assessment for 2 years. I remember 2019, given about the same time in 2019, and it was very familiar themes. We talked about North Korea. If you remember 2019, North Korea was pretty hot. And the intelligence assessment that Kim was unlikely to give up nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Talked about Iran and our judgment that Iran was at that time still complying with the nuclear constraints of the JCPOA. And on election interference, we warned that Russia would continue to target U.S. elections either through influence or through interference. And Dan Coates came out and said those things at the hearing, and it immediately, you can go back and look at the publicity that came out of it. Immediately, it was clear that the president was unhappy. What he chose to do with that dismay at the difference between his policy and our assessments was to basically denigrate the quality of it. And again, truth in advertising, I am always down for questioning intelligence because it always has some uncertainty with it. But this was basically saying, yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. Interesting enough, it's what Tulsi Gabbard faced right before the Operation Midnight Hammer. He said the same thing. So that was an example where we were straight down the middle, and the hearing itself was much more about the assessment than it was about the policy. They were asking us questions about it. I think that it is probably true. With Dan's leadership and my support, we were pretty eyes in the boaty about that line between our assessment and policy. And I think the president grew increasingly uncomfortable with that, and that's probably why 6 months later, neither one of us were in the same position. So, a couple just reflections on the difference between 19 and 26 was might have been the last time that we saw a hearing that was really mostly focused on the assessment itself and rather than what I've seen a move much more to all of it be talking about the policies
Hmm.
and using intelligence as the kinda hammer on either side. In 2019, we were dogmatic about the assessment. We both 6 months later didn't have a job, and now you see that not only has he put leaders in place that are more aligned politically, but this hearing was evidence that you're seeing them make a different decision about how they need to speak publicly in those hearings. So you're actually seeing the hearing move away from kind of the intelligence assessment and more toward that intersection of policy and intelligence, which is lovely friction, but only when it's equal tension. So I'm not sure. I think what we see in 26 systemically as a whole, not just the hearing, is that friction is less tolerated just in the kind of answers that were given. I think there's another thing that we see, and this is just a really personal reflection, is in the summer, in August 19, I decided to resign. Now, I was going to resign because it was clear I wasn't going to take my statutorily prescribed position as the acting director of national intelligence, but I decided to resign in part because I didn't want a rift between the intelligence community and the president to get worse. And I was afraid if I had insisted that I deserved that position, that that would increase the risk. So if you think about it, I basically made a systemic decision about preserving the institution, right? If you look at what Joe Kent did when he just resigned over Iran, he resigned because he didn't agree with the policy of the president. So you can say, yeah, it's two people making a decision to not continue in their position, but even in the difference between how the two of us did it, I think you can see this move away from just institutions and how they behave and the role of leaders to play the role of their institution and a move toward much more policy agreement or disagreement as the basis for how the institutions act and how leaders perform in them. What do you think about that? I haven't sprung that one on you before.
Yeah, so a couple things there. Can you remind us a little bit about that August of 2019? Was that Director Coates was asked to step down, and as a result, you should have been the acting DNI had you stayed, but there were some perceived issues with the base and the calls to drain the swamp of a career intelligence officer
Yes.
taking over the Director of National Intelligence, even in an acting position?
I have just tons of respect for Dan Coates because even though he was a classic political appointee into the role of the Director of National Intelligence, he had sat on the Senate Committee for Intelligence, but he had never really been intimate with intelligence. And that was pretty consistent with directors of national intelligence until Jim Clapper. He was very straight down the middle in terms of playing his role. And the threat assessment hearing was, I think, the last straw in a number of times where Director Coates had not hedged at all over the Helsinki when President Trump said he believed Putin over the intelligence community on whether there had been Russian influence. And Director Coates had come out in defending the intelligence community. So that had been coming for Director Coates, and so I think him being asked to step down was not a surprise. I think what was surprising was statutorily, and it came out of the commission in post 9/11, that the principal deputy is a career intelligence officer, and if the director of national intelligence were to leave, statutorily, the principal deputy director of national intelligence would be acting. I think what I ran afoul of was this was right when the big start of the deep state talk was, as though there was some big insidious plan to undermine political leaders, something that I refute to this day, and I think it's one of the biggest, most damaging lies that's being told. But I think that's when it really came about, and I think 2 things were probably true. Number 1 is, even though I would have continued and I think I would have made a great acting director for as long as he kept me in place, I think that the president didn't trust the system, and he wanted someone who he could trust. And I think his second concern was, the Congress actually thought I was okay for a girl. And what I mean by that's my colloquialism. I've spoken before Congress for a long time, that they had a great deal of respect, and I think the president was concerned that with me as acting, they would never confirm his person. So that's how they went, and I just decided
Yeah.
that the better part of valor was to trust that the intelligence community would do its job without me and step aside for others to come in. I will never know whether I made the right decision there, but that was my rationale and I stand by it. Me as a leader of the IC was never one day better than the women and men who did all the work to keep America safe in silence, and I just hopefully did a decent job representing their work. So I think it was the right decision, but I think you can see how that changed over time, right? You have many fewer career professionals now than you did in 2019.
Yeah. And not a decision you made lightly, and certainly some self sacrifice there. So appreciate you sharing
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, it broke my heart. You can hear me, I still say we. I love the craft and discipline of intelligence, and I loved being public servant. So when I talked about Bob Mueller at the beginning of this segment, I saw in him what I and so many of my colleagues aspired to be. And so losing that opportunity to serve America was hard.
You mentioned also Joe Kent's resignation and how that's different in this situation. The day before this hearing, March 17th, he resigned as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Joe Kent is a retired Army Green Beret and Special Forces operator, 11 combat deployments in the global war on terror, and he is a Gold Star husband. 2019, his wife, Shannon Kent, a Navy cryptologic technician, was killed by an ISIS suicide bomber in Syria. She was on her 5th deployment, and the two have 2 young children. Kent ran for Congress in Washington state. He was a vocal supporter of President Trump's America First foreign policy, and specifically the argument that the United States should stop getting drawn into open-ended conflicts in the Middle East. President Trump nominated him to lead the National Counterterrorism Center in early 2025, and he reported directly to D&I Gabbard. But his resignation statement was direct. He said he could not in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. He said Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States, and he said that the war was the product of a pressure campaign and echoed the playbook that drew the United States into Iraq. You only get one chance to resign, and it's the important decision on what hill you want to fight that battle on. So, do you have any other thoughts or comments on Joe Kent's
Yeah,
resignation?
I don't know him. I take him at his word. I would have probably relied heavier on intelligence, not, me being unable to effectively represent intelligence if we make this decision, but he made his. It's interesting if you read the 2013 speech by Mueller at UVA, one of the comments he makes is sometimes you have to stand alone, right? These decisions are hard. It's why I frustrate people when I won't just bash decisions that people make, is because there are a lot of things that go into doing it. So, if that's what Joe felt, I don't know that will have effect because it looks like almost a political decision rather than an institutional decision. It's weird. It's almost as though Dan Coates was more accepted than me because you kind of lose the institution. But I respect anyone who draws the line in the sand, and again, a person who lived a life of public service. So I respect him for that.
So, what do you want folks to walk away from this episode knowing or not misunderstand as they leave?
One is it is a big old goofy world, and the threat environment is broader and more simultaneous than it's ever been. There's a real role for intelligence, for the independence of intelligence. It can get better every day. It's harder to do it in this world, but there's a real role, and there's a reason why it is set apart from being part of the policy community. It needs to inform policy. but it does have to stand on its own. I love the point of technology being now at the center. I think that will drive the intelligence community to have to develop some new craft in order to be able to provide the same decision advantage that it has historically over my career. The continued move of the intelligence community to be willing to and able to articulate its basis for threat openly is an important move to make. And so the hearings are an important part of that dialogue with the American people. I wish we could have even more of it before decisions are made, not just either using intelligence as the reason or using that you don't believe in intelligence as the reason to not, but rather to use it as a foundational point of decision making, then have the conversation about how you decide anyway. I do think this hearing is a particularly great example of even more significant tension between the roles of intelligence and policy, how they seem to be blurring, how it isn't even for hand-picked people for each of these positions. When you feel that you must blur, it isn't comfortable and it doesn't come across with the same heft. And so I think that's a signal we should be watching, because if intelligence stops being brutally true, even if not perfectly accurate, decision makers don't have the best chance to make decisions. So if the tension isn't maintained between the two, you end up with some bad things on either side. So the worldwide threat assessment isn't just the list of dangers, it's also a window into how our system handles uncomfortable truths about the world that might be the most important signal of all when we look at this.
What else are you watching?
Let's see. Just saw this morning that the president announced that he's holding off on doing more damage to power infrastructure because he believes that there have been productive talks with Iran. I'll hold off my judgment, but I will always be hopeful. I always want good outcome for America. And then I'm going to be watching to hope that my bracket doesn't continue to sink into oblivion because because people might take away my former basketball player card.
Oh,
How about
that's
you?
fun. Yeah, we've got some more games today on Monday, the 23rd, and then Thursday, the men's bracket picks back up in the Sweet 16. Watching that as well. I'm also watching the National AI Policy Framework that came out last week. So I'd like to get your opinions on those 6 pillars maybe next week or in the coming weeks, and see as we continue to develop what is a part of this worldwide threat assessment is the race to AI and are trying to lead and continue to win, and the national framework that'll help us get there.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We talked about energy. I want to get to that at some point, but I think AI might be even more close to the board topic. What do you say? Maybe we ought to bring some experts in and have a conversation with them about this. There's so many dimensions to it. And though you and I are certainly brilliant, we might not know everything about AI. And the other thing I'm watching is, how's this thing going to resolve on funding TSA versus DHS? And where's that going to go? It's under the radar unless you happen to be standing in an airport.
Then you better get there early and have a long time to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's tough. Got some new federal assistance coming out there this week, though, right? ICE agents are coming to help.
Yeah. Press on, Eric. Press
Federal
on.
agents. Federal agents. Yeah. Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
We always want to hear what you think of our direction, focus, and insights. Is the conversation we want, even more than hearing that we're doing a good job. So let us know how we can better serve you. And join us each week for Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another. It makes all the difference.